The White House isn't just where laws get signed and speeches get made. It's where alligators roamed guest hallways, where mechanical horses got ridden in pajamas, and where the leader of the free world once got wedged in a bathtub so thoroughly that six grown men had to pull him out. So before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and get yourself comfortable. Grab a blanket, turn down the lights, and prepare for 100 bizarre White House moments they definitely didn't teach you in history class. Starting with the night the British showed up for dinner, uninvited. The night the British ate Madison's dinner. Picture this. It's 1814, and you're British soldiers marching through Washington. You break into the president's house, and there on the table sits a feast prepared for 40 people. Roasted meats, fresh bread, wine chilling in silver buckets. Madison and his wife Dolly had fled just hours earlier, leaving behind what was basically the world's most expensive catered event. So naturally, you sit down and eat it. Every last bite. Then, because manners only go so far during wartime, you torch the entire building. The flames were visible 50 miles away, turning the night sky orange like some apocalyptic bonfire. Imagine being a farmer in Maryland, looking toward the Capitol, watching history literally burn. The walls would stay charred black for years until they painted them white to cover the damage. Hence, the name. But if you think that's the messiest party the White House ever hosted, well, buckle up. Jackson's inauguration riot. Andrew Jackson's inauguration in 1829 was supposed to be a celebration of the common man finally getting his due. And boy, did the common man show up. Thousands of uninvited guests stormed the White House like it was a Black Friday sale at a frontier trading post. They stood on furniture with muddy boots. They shattered china that had been used since Jefferson's time. Women fainted in the crush. Men punched each other over hors d'oeuvres. Jackson himself, the tough-as-nails war hero, literally had to escape out a back window and hide in a hotel while his staff figured out damage control. The solution? They dragged giant tubs of whiskey-spiked punch onto the lawn, luring the mob outside like you'd bait raccoons away from garbage. It worked. But Jackson wasn't done leaving his mark on the White House. Not even close. Poll the profane parrot. So Andrew Jackson had a parrot named Paul. African gray, supposedly brilliant, lived in the White House during the 1830s. But here's the thing about parrots. They learn what they hear. And Jackson? Not exactly known for his genteel vocabulary. This man fought duels, threatened to hang his vice president, and regularly told people exactly where they could stick their opinions. Paul absorbed every word. By the time Jackson died in 1845, that bird could swear like a drunken sailor on shore leave. At Jackson's own funeral, surrounded by mourners in their Sunday best, Paul started letting loose with a stream of profanity so colorful, so relentlessly vulgar, that the Reverend had no choice but to have the bird physically removed from the service. Imagine that. You're trying to eulogize a president, and his parrot is yelling obscenities at the coffin. Of course, Jackson wasn't the only president whose household featured unexpected guests. The mysterious Mr. Wong John Tyler received what might be the strangest diplomatic gift in presidential history during the 1840s, a Chinese chef named Mr. Wong. Except Mr. Wong didn't really cook much. He mostly just existed. He'd hide in the East Room, playing what witnesses described as strange games with himself, delaying meetings because he'd be sitting cross-legged in the corner, completely unbothered. He wandered the halls at odd hours, appearing and disappearing like he owned the place. Staff had no idea what to do with him. Tyler couldn't exactly return a human being like unwanted flatware, so Mr. Wong just became part of the furniture, literally. He'd show up during state dinners, nod at guests, then vanish. Some historians think he might have actually been a spy, but honestly, the evidence suggests he was just beautifully, blissfully committed to doing absolutely nothing. Which brings us to the next president, who had his own relationship with bathroom furniture. Fillmore's bathtub incident. Millard Fillmore, often forgotten president, gave America something revolutionary in the 1850s, the first bathtub in the White House. Before this, presidents bathed in portable tubs filled by hand, which sounds about as relaxing as washing your hair in a bucket. Fillmore was proud of his modern porcelain installation, so proud, in fact, that he decided to test it himself before any official could critique it. He climbed in, settled into the warm water, and then couldn't get out. The tub was deep, the porcelain slippery, and Fillmore was not exactly an athlete. He flailed around like a turtle on its back until staff heard the commotion and rushed in to heave him out, dripping and mortified. The tub stayed. Fillmore's dignity did not. But at least he never had to worry about ghosts in the bathroom. That particular problem belonged to the next administration. Willie Lincoln's giggling ghost. Abraham Lincoln's son Willie died of typhoid fever in 1862. Just 11 years old, the grief nearly destroyed Mary Todd Lincoln. But according to staff during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency years later, Willie apparently didn't leave. Grant's employees reported a young boy's ghost racing through the corridors, giggling that high, bright laugh children make when they're playing tag. He'd appear in doorways, then vanish straight through walls before anyone could react. Some heard him in the East Room, where Willie's body had been prepared for burial. Others saw him near the Lincoln bedroom, where he'd slept. Grant himself never commented publicly, but his staff swapped stories and whispers, wondering if the little boy was still looking for his father. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the White House had plenty of other seance activity coming up. Mary Todd Lincoln made sure of that. Mary Todd Lincoln's green room seances. Mary Todd Lincoln didn't just mourn her husband after his assassination in 1865. She tried to contact him. She held seances in the green room with spiritualists who claimed they could summon Abe's ghost. Tables rapped out coded messages. Cold winds swept through sealed rooms. Mary swore she felt his presence, heard his voice offering advice from beyond. Some historians think she was genuinely trying to heal her shattered mind. Others suggest the mediums were charlatans exploiting a widow's grief. Either way, White House staff would find her sitting alone in the dark, whispering to empty chairs. The seances continued for months until advisors quietly convinced her to stop because, optics. But strange rituals in the White House were just getting started. Future administrations would bring their own brand of creative problem solving. Lemonade Lucy and the Whiskey Canes. Hayes became president in 1877, but it was his wife Lucy who made headlines. Lemonade Lucy banned all alcohol from the White House, making state dinners about as lively as a funeral at a library. Foreign diplomats were horrified. Senators grumbled. So the staff got creative. They began smuggling whiskey into formal dinners inside hollow walking canes, casually sipping from the handles when Lucy wasn't looking. Guests would lean over conspiratorially, sharing swigs during toasts made with lemonade. It was like Prohibition 15 years early, except everyone knew where the speakeasy was. Literally at the dinner table. Lucy supposedly never caught on, though some historians suspect she knew and chose to ignore it, maintaining her public temperance stance while letting the men have their fun. After all, what she didn't see couldn't hurt the cause. But speaking of things presidents preferred not to see, Arthur's garage sale of secrets. When Chester Arthur became president in 1881, he took one look at the White House furniture and declared it all garbage. Literally. He had 24 wagon loads of antiques, chairs, cabinets, and various presidential detritus hauled out and sold at public auction. Some pieces dated back to the Jefferson administration. Historians today weep thinking about what was lost. But rumors swirled that Arthur wasn't just redecorating. Some whispered he was purging evidence of previous scandals, documents hidden in desk drawers, letters stuffed in cushions. Was he covering something up, or was he just a man with strong opinions about interior design? We'll never know because whatever was in those wagons is long gone. But at least Arthur never had to worry about hiding medical secrets. That came next. Cleveland's secret surgery. In 1893, President Grover Cleveland discovered a rough patch in his mouth that turned out to be cancer. Jaw cancer, aggressive and terrifying. But Cleveland knew that if the public found out, the stock market would panic. The country was already in an economic depression. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He had surgery on a friend's yacht. Secretly. Off the coast of New York City. Doctors removed a chunk of his upper jaw while the boat rocked on the waves, stitching him back together with rubber prosthetics to fill the gap. Cleveland kept his mustache extra bushy to hide the scars. The press never found out until years later. He literally had part of his face removed in secret, then went right back to work. But physical courage wasn't the only kind you needed in the White House. The Harrisons and the electric shocks. Benjamin Harrison had electricity installed in the White House in 1891, making it one of the first homes in America with electric lights. Revolutionary, exciting, absolutely terrifying. Harrison and his wife Caroline were convinced the switches would electrocute them. They'd seen too many newspaper stories about people fried by this new technology. So they simply refused to touch any switches, ever. They'd leave lights burning all night rather than risk it. Servants had to follow them around, turning lights on and off like human clappers. Imagine being the most powerful person in the country, but too scared to flip a light switch. The Harrisons eventually left office with the electric bill of a small factory and their dignity slightly singed. Speaking of names, the next president made a permanent change to the building itself. How the White House got its name. Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901, and one of his first executive decisions was surprisingly mundane. He officially renamed the executive mansion to the White House. Why? Because his kids kept calling it that anyway. During a renovation, the building had been repainted, and Quentin, his youngest, started referring to it as the White House to his friends. The name caught on with the press. Roosevelt, ever practical, figured why fight it? So he had new stationery printed, made it official, and that was that. The People's House finally had the people's name. Of course, Teddy's kids would cause far more chaos than a simple name change, especially Quentin Roosevelt's hostage situation. Teddy Roosevelt's children treated the White House like their personal adventure playground, but Quentin took it furthest. In 1902, he convinced several Secret Service agents to play cops and robbers with him on the South Lawn. The agents, probably bored and amused, agreed. Big mistake. Quentin produced real rope from somewhere, never established where, and proceeded to tie up the agents during the arrest portion of the game. Then he just left them there, hogtied, on the lawn, in full view of tourists. It took 20 minutes before other staff noticed the trained security professionals trussed up like Thanksgiving turkeys, while an 8-year-old ran around cackling. Teddy reportedly laughed so hard he cried. But Quentin wasn't the only Roosevelt child causing trouble. His older half-sister had her own methods. Alice Roosevelt's rooftop rebellion. Alice Roosevelt, Teddy's daughter from his first marriage, was essentially ungovernable. In 1906, she was spotted smoking cigarettes on the White House roof, which was shocking enough for a young woman at the time. But she also carried a pet garter snake named Emily Spinach in her purse to formal events, pulling it out to horrify stuffy diplomats. She'd place bets at racetracks, drive cars at dangerous speeds, and generally treat societal expectations like suggestions for other people. When Teddy was asked why he didn't control her better, he famously said he could either run the country or control Alice, but not both. She lived to 96, outlasting most of her critics and remaining brilliantly, defiantly herself. Meanwhile, the next president had a more stationary problem. Taft's bathtub extraction, William Howard Taft, weighed over 300 pounds and made the mistake of testing the new, supposedly oversized White House bathtub in 1912. It was not oversized enough. He climbed in fine. Getting out. Completely different story. The porcelain was slick, the sides were high, and Taft's leverage was non-existent. He thrashed around like a beached whale until 6 aides heard the splashing and rushed in to physically extract him from what nearly became his porcelain prison. The incident spawned the nickname Big Lub, short for Big Tub, though that particular detail is disputed by historians who really don't want it to be true. Either way, Taft ordered an even bigger tub after that, but at least his bathroom didn't have livestock. That was the next guy's thing. Wilson's lawn sheep. Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913 and immediately faced a staffing problem. The White House needed its lawn mowed, but groundskeepers were expensive, and Wilson wanted to cut costs during World War I. His solution? Sheep. He brought in a flock to graze the lawn, including one ram named Pats, who became a minor celebrity. When Pats's wool was sheared, Wilson auctioned it off for nearly $100,000. That's in 1918 dollars, with proceeds going to the Red Cross. Tourists loved watching the sheep. Staff hated cleaning up after them. The sheep stayed until 1920, when Wilson finally admitted that maybe having livestock on the most famous lawn in America wasn't the most presidential look. But Wilson had bigger problems than sheep droppings. Edith Wilson's shadow presidency. In October 1919, Woodrow Wilson had a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and largely bedridden. His wife, Edith, made a decision. They wouldn't tell the public how bad it was. For the next 17 months, Edith screened every visitor, every document, every decision that reached Wilson. She'd take papers into his room, come out with his decisions, and no one could verify if Wilson was actually making them or if Edith was just signing his name. Historians call it the petticoat government or Mrs. President. Was she protecting him? Running a shadow presidency? Probably both. Either way, she wielded more power than most vice presidents dream of, and did it all while publicly insisting she was just helping her invalid husband. The next president brought very different energy to the office. Coolidge's nap bet. Calvin Coolidge was legendarily quiet and even more legendarily fond of naps. His wife Grace once bet $500, serious money in the 1920s, that Calvin could sleep through an entire cabinet meeting. She won. Coolidge settled into his chair during a policy discussion about tariffs or agriculture or something equally sleep-inducing, closed his eyes, and simply drifted off. His cabinet members noticed, exchanged awkward glances, and kept talking in whispers. Coolidge slept through the whole thing, woke up when someone dropped a folder, and asked, "What did I miss?" with zero embarrassment. Grace collected her winnings. Coolidge went back to napping. The man understood his limits and worked within them. But before Coolidge, there was Harding, who had very different nighttime activities. Harding's poker problem. Warren G. Harding loved poker almost as much as he loved bad decisions. In 1923, during one particularly disastrous late-night game in the White House, Harding bet and lost an entire set of historic china. The actual White House china. Priceless pieces that belonged in museums, gone to some dealer who probably couldn't believe his luck. But it gets better. Groundskeepers later found marked cards buried in the rose garden, suggesting Harding wasn't just bad at poker, he was being actively cheated in his own house. His administration would later become synonymous with corruption and scandal, so losing China in a rigged poker game feels almost on brand. At least the next president found healthier ways to stay active indoors. Coolidge's mechanical horse, Calvin Coolidge, might have loved naps, but he also had a mechanical horse installed in the Red Room in 1924. Not a real horse, a wooden mechanical contraption you could ride for exercise. Coolidge would climb onto this thing in his pajamas, rock back and forth while reading newspapers, and call it his workout routine. Staff would walk past and see the President of the United States gently bouncing on a fake horse at 7 in the morning, completely unbothered by how absurd it looked. No gym membership, no jogging, just a man, his mechanical horse, and the morning edition. He kept that thing for his entire presidency, and honestly, that might be the most relatable thing any president has ever done. Hoover's alligator problem. Herbert Hoover became president in 1929, inheriting the Great Depression and, less famously, his son Allen's pet alligators. Plural. These weren't cute little lizards you could keep in a terrarium. These were actual alligators that Allen kept in White House bathtubs and occasionally let roam the guest rooms. Imagine being a dignitary invited to breakfast, walking down a hallway in your finest morning coat, and suddenly there's a 4-foot reptile blocking your path, hissing like a broken radiator. Staff reports mention alligators snapping at ankles, which is exactly the kind of wake-up call no one wants before toast and eggs. The Secret Service hated them. Housekeepers refused to clean certain rooms. Allen thought it was hilarious. Hoover, dealing with economic collapse and breadlines, apparently decided live alligators were the least of his problems. Eventually, the gators were relocated to a zoo, but not before they'd traumatized an entire generation of White House guests. Speaking of animals with better PR, the next president's pet had an actual communications team. Fala's press secretary Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Scottish Terrier, Fala, became so famous during the 1930s and 40s that he needed his own press secretary. Not a person who occasionally answered questions about the dog. An actual staff member whose job was handling Fala's fan mail, which arrived by the thousands. Over 10,000 letters from Americans who adored this little black dog with the big personality. People sent him gifts. Children drew him pictures. Soldiers overseas asked for photos of Fala to keep in their pockets for luck. FDR once joked that Fala was more popular than he was, which probably wasn't far from the truth. The dog attended press conferences, traveled on presidential trips, and had his own Secret Service detail. When Republicans accused FDR of spending taxpayer money to retrieve Fala from Alaska, Roosevelt gave a speech defending his dog so effectively it's still called the Fala speech today. That dog had better media coverage than most senators. But Fala wasn't the only thing FDR made famous at the White House. The first legal beer in 13 years. When Prohibition finally died in 1933, FDR threw what might be the most justified party in American history, a beer summit in the East Room. For 13 years, alcohol had been illegal, driving drinking underground into speakeasies and bathtub gin operations that killed people with methanol poisoning. The 21st Amendment repealed that disaster in December, and FDR wasted no time. He hosted a gathering where legal beer flowed freely, toasts were made to sanity returning, and everyone probably got a little too enthusiastic about the whole thing. Imagine the relief, the sheer joy of drinking a beer without worrying about arrest or blindness from bad bootleg hooch. The White House party symbolized a nation collectively exhaling after more than a decade of failed moral legislation. Of course, celebrations would be tempered as the decade wore on, and war loomed closer. Eleanor Roosevelt, meanwhile, had her own ideas about White House preparedness. Eleanor's 3 a.m. air raid drills, Eleanor Roosevelt took civil defense very seriously during World War II, so seriously that in 1942, she turned the White House into a full-scale blackout drill site, complete with air raid sirens screaming at 3 in the morning. Staff would wake up in absolute panic, stumbling through darkened hallways, convinced German bombers were overhead. Eleanor would inspect their performance with a clipboard, noting who covered windows properly and who forgot to extinguish lights. She'd pace the grounds in complete darkness, checking for any light leaks that enemy aircraft might spot. The Secret Service thought she was slightly unhinged. FDR thought it was admirable, if exhausting. Neighbors in Washington probably wondered why the White House kept pretending the Luftwaffe was attacking Maryland. But Eleanor believed in being prepared, and if that meant traumatizing your staff with surprise drills in the middle of the night, so be it. The next president would face his own nighttime disturbances, though his came from sources decidedly less living. Truman's phantom roommates. Harry Truman moved into the White House in 1945 after FDR's death and immediately noticed something odd: footsteps. Constant, echoing footsteps in empty hallways, knocking on doors that no one was behind. He wrote letters to his wife Bess describing phantom sounds in his study late at night. Truman, a practical man not given to supernatural beliefs, couldn't explain it. He joked, maybe not entirely joking, that the ghosts of Andrew Jackson and Teddy Roosevelt were still hanging around, arguing over FDR's New Deal policies. Jackson would have hated government expansion. Roosevelt would have loved the conservation programs. Maybe they were duking it out in the spiritual realm while Truman tried to sleep. Staff reported similar experiences: cold spots, unexplained noises, the distinct feeling of being watched. Truman eventually moved across the street to Blair House during renovations, though whether the renovation or the ghosts motivated him more remains unclear. The next president had more tangible problems, specifically involving tiny rodents and his golf game. Eisenhower's war on squirrels. Dwight D. Eisenhower loved golf. He loved it so much that, in the 1950s, he had a putting green installed on the south lawn, perfect for practicing his short game between cabinet meetings and nuclear deterrence strategies. But there was a problem: squirrels. Specifically, squirrels who thought the putting green was an excellent place to bury acorns. They'd dig little holes right in Eisenhower's carefully maintained grass, ruining the surface and turning his practice sessions into an obstacle course. Ike, the man who planned D-Day, who coordinated the largest military invasion in history, declared total war on the squirrels. He ordered them trapped and relocated. They kept coming back. He had staff chase them away. The squirrels didn't care. They'd won wars of attrition before and weren't intimidated by 5-star generals. Eventually, Eisenhower accepted defeat, which is more than he did with the Nazis. The squirrels remained, the putting green survived, and Eisenhower learned that some enemies can't be defeated with strategy alone. The next president brought different kinds of controversies to White House recreation. JFK's rooftop pool and persistent rumors John F. Kennedy had chronic back pain from his PT 1019 injury during World War II. So in 1961, he installed a heated pool on the White House roof for therapy. Heated, private, accessible at all hours, medically necessary and completely reasonable. The problem is what happened after JFK's assassination and the rumors that started circulating. Whispers about late-night swim sessions with Marilyn Monroe, though hard evidence for those specific encounters remains frustratingly absent from the historical record. What we do know: JFK used the pool regularly, often multiple times a day. It was technically therapeutic. It also became the center of endless speculation about his personal life, fueled by his well-documented affairs and Monroe's famous Happy Birthday performance. Historians debate what actually happened in that rooftop pool versus what people wanted to believe happened. Either way, the pool itself was real, the back pain was real, and the gossip was definitely real. The next president had his own unconventional approach to White House meetings, though his was significantly less glamorous. LBJ's bathroom diplomacy, Lyndon B. Johnson had no concept of personal boundaries. None. In 1963 and beyond, he regularly conducted presidential business from the White House toilet. Not near the toilet, on it. He'd sit there, door open, pants around his ankles, and summon advisors to discuss Vietnam policy, civil rights legislation, or budget concerns while handling his own business. Aides would stand in the doorway, desperately trying to maintain eye contact with the ceiling, while LBJ gestured emphatically about Medicare. He'd call senators on the phone mid-flush, the sound of rushing water serving as punctuation for his arguments. Now listen here. Flush. We need those votes. Johnson viewed it as a power move, a way to keep people off balance and assert dominance. Everyone else viewed it as horrifying. But you didn't say no to LBJ, so they endured what became known as bathroom diplomacy. At least it wasn't dangerous. The next president's dog, however, posed actual physical threats to foreign dignitaries. Checkers and the French incident. Richard Nixon's famous dog Checkers, yes, the one from the Checkers speech, had apparently inherited some of Nixon's paranoia by 1968. During a state dinner with the French ambassador, Checkers reportedly bit the ambassador's wife, drawing blood and causing a minor international incident. Nixon's team blamed separation anxiety, claiming the dog missed its owner during formal events. The French were not amused. They'd come for diplomatic relations and canapes, not rabies concerns and awkward apologies. The incident required Nixon to personally call and apologize, which must have been a deeply uncomfortable conversation. Yes, about my dog attacking your wife. Whether Checkers sensed enemies of the state or just didn't like French perfume remains unknown, but the dog stayed away from foreign dignitaries after that. Nixon himself would soon give everyone much better reasons for anxiety, though those reasons wouldn't involve teeth. The plumbers and the tapes. In 1972, Nixon's so-called plumbers, a covert White House unit tasked with stopping leaks, broke into a psychiatrist's office looking for dirt on Daniel Ellsberg, who'd leaked the Pentagon Papers. This was illegal, paranoid, and incredibly stupid. It was also just the beginning. When the Watergate scandal exploded, White House tapes captured Nixon's growing paranoia in real time. You can hear him ordering cover-ups, discussing hush money, and basically incriminating himself while the recorder spun away, preserving every word for posterity and prosecutors. The tapes revealed a president consumed by enemies lists, convinced everyone was out to get him, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy once people heard what he'd been saying about them. Nixon would resign in 1974, but not before the White House experienced some truly bizarre security incidents, including one that arrived by helicopter. The stolen helicopter joyride. In February 1974, a young Army private named Robert Preston stole a helicopter from Fort Meade and flew it straight to the White House South Lawn. He'd been a helicopter mechanic, knew how to fly, and apparently just decided one day to prove he could do it. He buzzed the grounds, circled a few times while Secret Service agents freaked out, then landed on the lawn like he was parking at a grocery store. He climbed out, hands up, and told agents he just wanted to prove he could fly. No political statement, no assassination attempt, just a guy with access to military aircraft and questionable decision-making skills. He was arrested immediately, evaluated psychiatrically, and eventually court-martialed. But for a few surreal minutes, a stolen Army helicopter sat on the most secure lawn in America, while security protocols combusted. And speaking of helicopter incidents during this era, Nixon's own exit would involve some aerial dramatics. Marine One's resignation, farewell, On August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned and boarded Marine One for the last time, lifting off from the South Lawn in that famous photograph with his arms raised in victory furs that looked more like surrender. The pilot, reportedly emotional about the whole situation, flew low over the White House in what witnesses described as a farewell buzz. He dipped close enough to the roof that people swore the helicopter nearly clipped the antennas. It was unnecessary, dramatic, and possibly unsafe. Basically, the perfect metaphor for Nixon's entire presidency. Whether the pilot did it intentionally as tribute or just got caught up in the moment remains unclear. Either way, Marine One roared over the building one last time before carrying Nixon away to California and historical infamy. But helicopter incidents weren't the only security problems plaguing the White House during this period. The fence jumpers were just getting started. Gerald Gaines and the persistent intruder. In 1975, Gerald Gaines became one of the most persistently annoying fence jumpers in White House history. He scaled the fence 4 times. 4. Each time security would arrest him, process him, and presumably explain that jumping the White House fence was illegal. He did not care. On one memorable occasion, he made it onto the grounds and started chasing President Ford's daughter Susan across the lawn like some twisted game of tag. Susan ran. Gaines chased. Secret Service tackled him. Repeat. The incident highlighted how porous White House security had become during the 70s. Gaines wasn't particularly threatening, mostly just determined and possibly confused, but the fact that he could repeatedly breach what should be the most secure location in America was deeply concerning. After the 4th incident, they finally kept him in custody long enough that he couldn't immediately return. But he wasn't the last intruder to test the fence, and the next one would end much more tragically. Chester Plummer's fatal mistake. On Christmas Day, 1976, Chester Plummer jumped the White House fence armed with a pipe. Not a gun. A pipe. But when Secret Service agents ordered him to halt, he kept advancing, pipe raised. A rookie agent, probably terrified and operating on adrenaline and training, shot him dead. Plummer became the first fence jumper killed on White House grounds in modern history. The incident sparked debates about use of force, mental health, and whether someone wielding a pipe truly warranted lethal response. But in the moment, with a man refusing commands and advancing with a weapon, the agent made a split-second decision. Investigations cleared him. Protocols were reviewed. The fence remained, though it clearly wasn't doing its job. People kept trying to get over it, each with their own bizarre motivations, like the martial arts enthusiast who showed up 2 years later, the kung fu fence jumper. In 1978, Anthony Henry decided the White House needed to witness his martial arts skills. He showed up wearing a white gi, the traditional karate uniform, vaulted the fence with impressive athleticism, and challenged Secret Service agents to a duel. With knives. He had knives strapped to his outfit. This was not a friendly sparring match invitation. Agents, understandably not interested in testing their hand-to-hand combat skills against a possibly unhinged martial arts practitioner with blades, drew their firearms and ordered him to drop the weapons. Henry apparently believed his kung fu was superior to bullets, which showed poor understanding of physics. He was tackled, disarmed, and arrested before he could demonstrate any techniques. Whether he was mentally ill, looking for fame, or genuinely believed he could defeat presidential security through martial arts remains unclear. Either way, he joined the growing list of people who learned that the White House fence was not the right place to showcase your talents. At least the next trespasser came with better intentions, sort of. Willie Nelson's rooftop session. In 1980, Willie Nelson performed at a White House concert for Jimmy Carter. After the show, Willie and someone from the Carter family, accounts differ on exactly who, went up to the White House roof. And Willie, being Willie, lit up a joint. He smoked marijuana on the roof of the White House, probably enjoying the view of the National Mall while getting pleasantly stoned on federal property. Secret Service agents were nearby. They definitely saw. They chose not to see. It's one of those things where everyone involved made a silent agreement that this was not happening, despite it very obviously happening. Willie later confirmed the story with his characteristic laid back attitude, treating it like the most natural thing in the world. Carter never officially commented, maintaining plausible deniability. But somewhere, there's a Secret Service report that must read like fiction. Subject observed smoking on roof. No action taken. It's the most 1980 thing that could have happened. The next president's pet problems were more chaotic than criminal. Lucky's Rose Garden rampage, Ronald Reagan's Bouvier de Flandre, named Lucky, was a large dog with absolutely no training or manners. In December 1982, during a photo opportunity in the Rose Garden, Lucky decided she'd had enough of standing still. Nancy Reagan was holding the leash, wearing an expensive designer gown, when Lucky spotted something interesting, probably a squirrel. Continuing their eternal war with presidents, and took off at full speed. The leash went taut. Nancy, not weighing enough to serve as anchor, was dragged across the perfectly manicured lawn on live television. Her gown ripped. Her shoes came off. Cameras captured every mortifying second. Ronald watched helplessly as his wife disappeared behind a hedge, still attached to a galloping dog. Lucky was eventually caught. Nancy survived with only her dignity damaged. The dog was swiftly relocated to their California ranch, where it could drag people across open fields without embarrassing the nation. But unruly dogs weren't the only security concern. Sometimes people just walked right in. The meter reader who toured the White House. In 1985, a meter reader named Robert Latta was doing his job near the White House when he saw the Marine Band heading inside. On a whim, he just walked in with them. Nobody stopped him. Nobody checked credentials. He didn't even have a uniform that matched. He simply blended into the group and strolled through the most secure building in America. For 14 minutes, Latta toured hallways, peeked into rooms, and apparently enjoyed the architecture. Finally, someone asked him who he was. "Where's the president?" he asked, like he'd just stopped by for a chat. Security escorted him out, probably while reviewing every procedure they'd ever learned. The incident revealed terrifying gaps in White House security. If a random meter reader could walk in with a marching band, what could a trained operative do? Reviews were conducted. Protocols were tightened. And somewhere, a meter reader has the best dinner party story ever. Rosita Bourbon's Ladder and Heels. In 1986, Rosita Bourbon approached the White House fence with a homemade ladder. She was wearing heels, not practical fence-climbing footwear. She set up her ladder, climbed it with impressive balance considering the footwear, dropped onto the White House grounds, and calmly walked toward the building. When arrested, she demanded tea with Reagan. Not a meeting, not a discussion. Tea. Like she'd just popped by for a social call and was mildly inconvenienced by all the security personnel. Bourbon never explained her reasoning beyond the tea request. Was she mentally ill? Making a political statement? Just really wanted Earl Grey with the president? We'll never know. She was processed, evaluated, and released without charges, joining the long list of people who thought the White House fence was more suggestion than barrier. But at least Bourbon had a plan, sort of. The next fence jumper didn't even make it up the stairs. The economic fix-it man. In 1987, Mike Davis cleared the White House fence and sprinted toward Reagan's West Wing stairs, apparently convinced he had solutions to America's economic problems. He made it remarkably far before encountering an unexpected enemy. A rug. He tripped on an elegantly placed carpet runner, went down hard, and was tackled by Secret Service while yelling, "I'm here to fix the economy." Whether he had actual policy proposals or just really strong opinions about interest rates remains unknown because nobody bothered to ask. They were too busy arresting him for trespassing. Davis's economical solutions, whatever they were, died with his dignity on that West Wing rug. The incident added to the growing concern about fence security, though it also proved that sometimes the best defense against intruders is just proper interior decorating. But the fence jumpers and bizarre incidents of the 80s were just a preview of the strange years ahead. The Cessna on the South Lawn. On September 12th, 1994, Frank Corder stole a Cessna 150 from an airport in Maryland. He'd been drinking, was depressed about his failing marriage, and apparently decided the best course of action was to crash a small plane into the White House. He flew low over Washington, approaching from the south, and aimed straight for the mansion. The Clintons weren't home. They were staying at Blair House during renovations, but that didn't stop Corder. He crashed onto the south lawn just short of the building, hitting the ground with enough force to kill him instantly. The Cessna crumpled like aluminum foil. Debris scattered across the perfectly manicured grass. It was 2 a.m, but the sound woke the entire neighborhood. Security had no warning because radar didn't track small aircraft well back then. The incident exposed terrifying vulnerabilities in White House airspace protection. Corder left no manifesto, no clear explanation. Just a stolen plane and a fresh crater in America's front yard. But aerial attacks weren't the only threat that autumn. Just weeks later, someone decided to use more traditional weapons. 29 rounds on Pennsylvania Avenue. On October 29th, 1994, barely 6 weeks after the Cessna crash, Francisco Martin Duran stood on Pennsylvania Avenue with a semi-automatic rifle and opened fire on the White House. 29 rounds. He sprayed bullets at the building's facade while tourists scattered and Secret Service agents scrambled. Duran had been fixated on conspiracy theories, convinced something sinister was happening inside. When arrested, he rambled about strange sights and government mind control, though accounts of his exact claims vary. What's certain? He fired at the White House in broad daylight, hitting windows and walls, but miraculously injuring no one. He was tackled by bystanders, regular citizens who jumped him while he reloaded, before agents could reach him. Duran was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The incident prompted yet another security review, more barriers, more protocols. But protocols can't stop someone determined to climb over them, as the next year would prove when speed became the problem rather than weapons. The sprinter who almost made it. In 1995, Ryan Thomas demonstrated that sometimes simple athleticism beats sophisticated security. He jumped the White House fence and just ran. Fast. Really fast. Security dogs were released. He outran them. Agents gave chase. He had a head start. Thomas sprinted across the lawn like he was going for Olympic gold, heading straight for the north portico entrance. He actually made it to the front door before agents finally tackled him. No weapons, no clear motive beyond, apparently wanting to see if he could do it. The scary part wasn't that he jumped the fence. Lots of people had done that. The scary part was how far he got with nothing but speed and determination. If he'd had malicious intent instead of just boundary issues, those extra seconds could have mattered. Thomas was arrested, evaluated, and disappeared into the system. But his sprint exposed yet another security gap that needed addressing. Of course, the next major intruder would bring actual tools to the job. The man with the grappling hook. In 2003, Robert Pickett scaled the White House fence, though accounts vary on exactly how he breached security. What's documented, he made it onto the grounds with clear intent and was found carrying materials suggesting planning. He claimed he needed to deliver a message to President Bush, though what that message was remains unclear. Pickett had a history of erratic behavior and grievances against the government. When confronted, he didn't resist violently, but insisted he had important information only the president could hear. It was the same pattern seen in so many fence jumpers: mental illness, obsession, conviction that direct access to power was the only solution. Security detained him without incident, added him to the growing database of people who thought the White House fence was more guideline than law. But at least Pickett wasn't motivated by romantic delusions. That particular flavor of crazy arrived 2 years later, with someone convinced they'd found their soulmate. The Chelsea Clinton stalker. In 2005, Sean Cox breached White House security with a specific target in mind: Chelsea Clinton. He was convinced they were destined to be together, that she was sending him secret messages through the television, that their cosmic connection transcended reality. This wasn't teenage crush territory. This was full-blown psychotic delusion backed by fence-jumping determination. Cox managed to get onto the grounds before being subdued. During evaluation, doctors found him completely detached from reality, living in a fantasy world where his relationship with Chelsea was real and reciprocated. He was diagnosed with severe mental illness and committed indefinitely to a psychiatric facility. Chelsea presumably was horrified but unsurprised. Public figures attract this kind of obsession with disturbing regularity. The incident highlighted how many fence jumpers were driven by untreated mental illness rather than political motivation. But mental illness manifests in many forms, including the next intruder's peculiar obsession with Shakespeare and repetition. The Shakespeare fence jumper. Brian Patterson jumped the White House fence multiple times in 2006, and each time he had something theatrical to say to the guards who arrested him. Whether he actually quoted Shakespeare or just spoke in dramatic fashion, Patterson treated each breach like a performance, complete with grand pronouncements and theatrical gestures. Guards would tackle him, process him, release him, and he'd return weeks later to do it again. 4 times in just a few months. It became almost routine. Patterson's back. Security knew him by name, knew his patterns, knew he wasn't actually dangerous beyond the trespassing itself. But they still had to treat each incident as a serious breach because what if this time was different? What if the theatrical guy suddenly turned violent? Patterson eventually stopped, whether through legal intervention, medication, or just getting bored. But for a while, the White House fence had its own recurring theatrical performer. At least he was predictable. The next major security breach came from somewhere no one expected: a state dinner guest list. The state dinner crashers. In November 2009, Mikhail and Tariq Salahi walked into a White House state dinner, honoring the Indian Prime Minister without invitations. They just showed up in formal wear, smiled at security, and somehow got waved through. They posed for photographs with Vice President Biden. They shook hands with officials. They ate the food. They mingled like they belonged there, and no one stopped them for hours. The incident was only discovered later when the Salahis posted photos on social media, because of course they did. Turns out they were aspiring reality TV stars looking for publicity. They got it. They later appeared on Real Housewives of D.C., where Mikhail bragged about the stunt. Congressional hearings followed. Heads rolled in the Secret Service. Protocols were revamped, but the damage was done. 2 random people had walked into one of the most exclusive, supposedly secure events in the world. If they could do it, what could trained operatives accomplish? The question haunted security planners. 5 years later, they'd get a terrifying answer. The East Room Sprinter. On September 19th, 2014, Omar Gonzalez jumped the White House fence and didn't stop. He sprinted past officers, across the lawn, up the steps, through the north portico door that someone had inexplicably left unlocked, into the East Room, deep into the residence, before agents finally tackled him. When restrained, he was yelling about demons in the White House, convinced he was on some kind of mission to cleanse the building of evil forces. Gonzalez was an Iraq War veteran suffering from PTSD and mental illness, armed with a knife, completely out of touch with reality. The incident sparked a massive scandal. How did he get so far? Why was the door unlocked? Where were the dogs? The agents? The multiple layers of security that should have stopped him at the fence? The Secret Service director resigned. Entire protocols were rewritten. But Gonzalez's deep penetration into the building remained one of the most serious security failures in modern White House history. And somehow, incredibly, he wasn't the only fence jumper that year. Not even close. The Pikachu incident. Later in 2014, another individual managed to breach White House security. Though details of this incident remain less publicized than Gonzalez's dramatic sprint. What's clear from documented reports, the pattern of security failures that year exposed systematic problems rather than isolated incidents. Multiple people found vulnerabilities in fence security, sometimes carrying unusual items or wearing strange attire. Each breach prompted reviews, but the reviews couldn't happen fast enough to prevent the next incident. The Secret Service was overwhelmed, understaffed, and clearly struggling to adapt to evolving threats. Traditional security models assumed people jumping the fence were isolated mentally ill individuals, rather than a steady stream of people testing the defenses. By the end of 2014, the White House fence had seen more successful breaches than the previous decade combined. Something had to change, and it wasn't just protocols. The physical barriers themselves needed upgrading. But before any changes could be implemented, another violent intruder made the problem even more urgent. The man who punched police dogs. On November 26, 2014, Dominic Adesanya cleared the White House fence and did something even more reckless than sprinting at agents. He attacked the security dogs. When Belgian Malinois were released to intercept him, Adesanya started punching them. The dogs, trained for exactly this scenario, didn't appreciate being assaulted. They bit him, repeatedly. Adesanya kept fighting, fueled by what was later determined to be untreated schizophrenia and a complete break from reality. He believed he was on a divine mission, that the White House contained secrets he needed to expose. He made it to the North Portico before agents could pull him down, bleeding from dog bites, still fighting, still yelling about his mission. He was hospitalized, evaluated, and charged with multiple offenses. The dogs received extra treats, and security planners added "attacks the dogs" to their list of scenarios they apparently needed to prepare for. But attacks on security animals weren't the worst violence fence jumpers could bring, as the next incident would demonstrate. The demon fighter with mace. In March 2017, Jonathan Tran jumped the White House fence carrying a backpack full of concerning items. When agents confronted him, he sprayed mace, though whether he actually made contact with agents or just sprayed wildly remains unclear from public reports. What's documented? He had a backpack, he resisted arrest, and he believed he had an important mission. Like so many fence jumpers before him, Tran appeared to be suffering from mental illness, convinced of conspiracies or threats that existed only in his mind. He made it onto the grounds but was quickly subdued once agents got past the initial surprise of being attacked with mace on their own lawn. Tran joined the long list of people whose untreated mental health conditions led them to believe the White House fence was a barrier they needed to cross. Security continued adapting, adding more sensors, more cameras, more officers, but technology and manpower couldn't prevent every breach, especially when the threat came from unexpected directions, like, say, a toddler. The smallest intruder. In April 2023, a toddler accomplished what dozens of armed, determined adults had attempted. He breached White House security. Sort of. The tiny boy squeezed through the bars of the fence, which were apparently spaced just wide enough for a determined small child to wiggle through. Secret Service agents spotted him immediately, walked over, picked him up, and carried him back to his mortified parents on the other side. No weapons, no conspiracy theories, no mental illness, just a curious toddler who saw bars and thought, I can fit through those. Agents reportedly found the whole thing hilarious, posing for photos with the little intruder before returning him to his family with a warning to watch him more carefully. The incident went viral on social media, providing much-needed comic relief after years of serious security breaches. Still, it raised valid questions. If a toddler could squeeze through, what about drones? What about someone with actual malicious intent and better planning? Security reviews continued, as they always would. But at least this breach ended in giggles rather than arrests. Of course, not all White House security concerns involved physical intruders. Some were considerably less tangible. Abigail Adams and the spectral laundry. According to White House staff reports going back decades, Abigail Adams still hasn't finished her laundry. Multiple witnesses throughout the 20th century claimed to see her ghost in the East Room, arms extended as if hanging washing on a line, moving through the motions of a chore she performed in life. The scent of lavender soap reportedly accompanies these sightings, wafting through halls with no clear source. Staff members would smell it first, then sometimes catch a glimpse of a figure in old-fashioned dress, transparent and focused on her eternal task. Abigail had used the East Room for drying laundry during her brief time in the unfinished White House in 1800, when the building was barely habitable and everything was improvised. Whether she's actually haunting the place or these reports represent collective tradition and imagination, they've persisted long enough to become part of White House folklore. Even skeptical staff members admit certain rooms feel odd sometimes, though they usually attribute it to old building quirks rather than ghosts. But if any ghost actually haunted the White House, the next one would be the obvious candidate. Lincoln appears to Churchill. Winston Churchill visited the White House during World War II and specifically requested the Lincoln bedroom. Big mistake. According to Churchill's own account, though he told the story with varying degrees of seriousness, he emerged from the bathroom one evening to find a tall figure standing by the fireplace, Abraham Lincoln, wearing a top hat, and nothing else. Churchill, naked himself and holding a cigar, reportedly said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." The figure vanished. Churchill grabbed his pistol, searched the room, found nothing, and supposedly refused to sleep there again. Whether Churchill genuinely believed he'd seen a ghost or was embellishing for entertainment is debated. He told the story multiple times with different details, suggesting either repeated encounters or a good yarn that improved with retelling. Either way, Lincoln's ghost became the most famous White House phantom, reported by multiple witnesses over decades. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands would have her own Lincoln encounter, though hers was considerably more dramatic and involved less nudity. The Queen faints. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands stayed at the White House during the 1940s. Late one night, she heard knocking on her bedroom door. She called out, "Come in," and the door opened to reveal a tall figure in a top hat and period clothing. Abraham Lincoln. Wilhelmina fainted on the spot. When she came to, the figure was gone, but staff found her unconscious on the floor, insisting she'd seen Lincoln's ghost. Some versions of the story claim her bed levitated briefly, though that detail appears in fewer accounts and might be later embellishment. What's documented? The Queen mentioned her strange experience. Staff took it seriously enough to move her to a different room, and she never stayed in that particular bedroom again. Whether she experienced a ghost, a hallucination, or a very strange dream remains unknowable, but her account added to Lincoln's reputation as the White House's most active ghost, though other presidents apparently hadn't left the building entirely either. Jackson's eternal rage. Andrew Jackson's ghost reportedly haunts the Rose Room, where his bed once stood. Staff throughout the decades have reported hearing laughter, rough, angry laughter, followed by cursing. The bed shakes sometimes, as if Jackson's ghost is still chopping wood or fighting duels or doing whatever violent activities occupied his living hours. Cold spots appear. Doors slam. Some witnesses claim to hear stomping, like someone pacing furiously while arguing with invisible opponents. Given Jackson's personality in life, combative, profane, prone to dueling and threatening violence, it tracks that his ghost would be equally unpleasant. Harry Truman mentioned hearing footsteps and attributed them partly to Jackson's spirit. Whether Jackson's actual ghost roams the halls or the building's reputation creates expectation that shapes interpretation of normal old building sounds, the reports persist. Jackson's presence, real or imagined, remains as stubborn as the man himself. But at least Jackson's ghost stays inside. The next spirit preferred the gardens. Dolly Madison's garden defense. Dolly Madison famously saved Washington's portrait when the British burned the White House in 1814. Apparently, she's still protective of the place. According to reports from Eleanor Roosevelt's time, Dolly's ghost guards the rose garden specifically. When groundskeepers attempted to dig up the roses during the Roosevelt administration, planning to redesign the space, Eleanor had a dream about Dolly planting roses, her hands in the soil, tending the garden with obvious love. Eleanor woke to sounds of digging, though no one was actually working at that hour. She mentioned this to staff who shared stories about feeling watched in the rose garden, about tools moving, about an overall sense that someone very much wanted those roses to stay exactly where they were. The redesign plans were quietly dropped. The roses remained. Whether Dolly's spirit actually intervened or Eleanor simply found the dreams and stories compelling enough to preserve history, the rose garden survived. But not all White House ghosts were adults watching over the property. Some were children still playing their eternal games. Willie Lincoln never left, Abraham Lincoln's son. Willie died at age 11 in 1862, and multiple witnesses over the decades claimed he never really left. Grant-era staff reported a young boy giggling in hallways, appearing briefly before vanishing through solid walls. Cold spots would form suddenly in rooms where Willie had played. Toy soldiers, gifts given to Willie during his illness, were sometimes found arranged in formation, though no one admitted touching them. The East Room, where his body had been prepared for burial, was a particular hotspot for sightings. Staff would glimpse a small figure in period clothing, always moving, always playful, as if still enjoying the White House as his giant playground. Whether Willie's spirit actually remained or grieving staff and subsequent employees created shared stories that persisted through tradition, the reports continued into the modern era. Ghost or collective memory, Willie became part of the building's story, and he wasn't the last president's ghost rumored to haunt the halls. Harrison's attic chains. William Henry Harrison served the shortest presidency in history, just 31 days, dying of pneumonia in April 1841. According to White House staff reports from various decades, he never quite accepted his abbreviated term. His ghost supposedly haunts the attic, rattling chains and moaning about his rainy inaugural speech, which lasted nearly 2 hours in cold, wet weather. He caught pneumonia and never recovered. Staff climbing to the attic for storage or maintenance have reported hearing chains dragging across floorboards, though no chains exist up there. Moaning echoes from empty corners. Cold drafts appear in sealed spaces. Whether Harrison's spirit actually remains, bitter about his stolen presidency and preventable death, or whether attic noises in a centuries-old building naturally sound unsettling and staff attributed meaning to random creaks, the reports persisted long enough to join White House ghost lore. Harrison may have had the shortest presidency, but his ghost apparently intends to stick around, making up for lost time by haunting the building he barely got to occupy. Anne Surratt's desperate plea. Mary Surratt was hanged in July 1865 for conspiring in Lincoln's assassination. Her daughter Anne spent weeks desperately trying to secure a presidential pardon, banging on doors, pleading with officials, begging President Johnson for mercy. She failed. Mary became the first woman executed by the U.S. government. According to White House staff reports over the decades, Anne's ghost still hasn't given up. Witnesses claim to hear frantic knocking on doors late at night, followed by the sound of a young woman's voice pleading for clemency that will never come. The knocking moves from room to room, desperate and insistent, as if Anne is still searching for someone with the power to save her mother. Whether her spirit actually haunts the building or staff members interpreting old building sounds through the lens of tragedy, the reports persisted long enough to join White House ghost lore. But Anne wasn't the only person with property grievances against the White House, though most complaints didn't continue beyond death. The landowner who never left David Burns owned much of the land that became Washington, D.C., including the plot where the White House now stands. He wasn't thrilled about selling, but eminent domain doesn't really care about your feelings. According to various White House staff accounts, Burns never quite accepted the transaction. His ghost supposedly haunts the Yellow Oval Room, whispering about land deeds and stolen property, muttering complaints about the government taking what was rightfully his. Staff have reported hearing a man's voice discussing acreage and boundaries when the room is empty. Papers rustle, without wind. The smell of tobacco, Burns' preferred vice, sometimes fills the air. Whether Burns' spirit actually remained to argue property rights from beyond the grave, or whether these reports represent staff projecting historical knowledge onto ambiguous experiences, the stories persisted. Burns might have lost the legal battle in life, but in death, he apparently still files complaints. Of course, property disputes weren't the only source of lingering spirits. Some ghosts had more tragic origins. The aide who sank with the Titanic Major Archibald Butt served as military aide to both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. In April 1912, he boarded the Titanic, heading home from a European vacation that was supposed to help him relax from the stress of managing the Roosevelt-Taft political split. He went down with the ship, last seen helping women and children into lifeboats. According to White House staff reports from subsequent years, Butt's ghost appears in the Yellow Oval Room, the same room where Burns allegedly argues about property. Witnesses describe seeing a man in military uniform folding linens or organizing papers, going through the motions of his former duties. He appears solid at first, then fades when approached. Some attribute cold spots in that room to Butt's presence. Whether his spirit actually returned to the job he never finished, or whether staff simply honored his memory through ghost stories, Butt became part of the building's spectral roster. But not all ghost encounters involved seeing figures. Sometimes it was just voices. The phantom presidential debate. Harry Truman reported hearing arguments in the White House late at night. Loud, angry debates between what he believed were Andrew Jackson's and Theodore Roosevelt's ghosts, apparently disagreeing about FDR's policies. Truman wrote about these experiences in letters to his wife, describing how the voices would rise and fall, how drapes would billow when windows were closed, how floors would creak with invisible footsteps. He specifically mentioned the arguments seemed to center around Roosevelt's portrait, as if the two dead presidents were confronting the image of the third. Whether Truman genuinely believed in ghosts or was using colorful language to describe the eerie sounds all old buildings make, he treated the experiences seriously enough to document them. The White House, filled with history and the weight of presidential decisions, apparently felt haunted even to practical men like Truman. And future presidents would have their own strange encounters, sometimes involving their pets, who sensed things humans couldn't. Rex and the Lincoln bedroom, Ronald Reagan's King Charles Spaniel. Rex reportedly refused to enter the Lincoln bedroom. The dog would approach the doorway, then stop, hackles raised. barking at absolutely nothing visible to human eyes. Staff who witnessed this behavior described Rex acting terrified of something tall in the room. Ironic, given Lincoln's ghost is typically described as a tall figure. The dog would whine, back away, and no amount of coaxing could convince him to cross the threshold. Reagan mentioned this behavior in interviews, treating it as curious rather than frightening. Whether Rex sensed some residual energy Lincoln left behind, reacted to subtle environmental factors humans couldn't detect, or simply didn't like that particular room for mundane dog reasons, his consistent refusal became part of White House lore. Animals supposedly sense things we can't, and Rex apparently sensed something in Lincoln's former bedroom that he wanted absolutely no part of. But dogs weren't the only ones detecting strange presences in the residence. The Bush daughters' entertainment, Jenna and Barbara Bush, during their father's presidency in the 2000s, reportedly heard unusual sounds in certain White House rooms. Opera music and jazz would drift from fireplaces when no music was playing anywhere in the building. Staff, when asked about it, would mention the old spirits entertaining themselves, treating it as normal White House activity rather than something requiring investigation. Whether the daughters actually experienced these sounds or whether staff were playing up the building's haunted reputation to entertain the first daughters, the stories added to the atmosphere. Old buildings have acoustic quirks. Pipes carry sounds from distant sources. Wind creates music in chimneys. Or maybe past residents really do enjoy ghostly concerts in empty rooms. Either way, the Bush daughters joined the long list of White House occupants who experienced things they couldn't quite explain. And the next first family would have even stranger encounters, though theirs involved more physical sensations. The Obamas and the gnawing presence. According to some accounts, the Obama family reported strange sensations in the residence, specifically the feeling of something brushing against their ankles, or a gnawing sensation, as if invisible pets were seeking attention. Staff joked about spectral White House animals, perhaps FDR's beloved Fala still roaming the halls decades after his death, or other presidential pets who'd never quite left. Whether the Obamas actually experienced these sensations, or whether this represents staff stories rather than first-hand accounts, it fit the pattern of White House occupants feeling presences they couldn't see. Old carpets shift. Radiators make strange noises. Or maybe all those presidential pets really do stick around, still loyal to a building they once called home. Ghost stories aside, the White House had real history worth exploring. Stories grounded in documented fact rather than spectral speculation. And that history started with the building's very construction, which had its own controversies. The construction delays. The White House construction began in 1792, and like any major building project, it faced delays, budget overruns, and worker complaints. Construction was difficult. The site required extensive grading, materials had to be transported, and skilled labor was scarce. Workers faced harsh conditions, and some left the project, though accounts of why vary. The building took 8 years to complete, finally becoming habitable in 1800 when John Adams moved in. The slow construction meant the first president, George Washington, never actually lived in the house named after him. He oversaw the planning and construction, but died in 1799, 1 year before completion. The delays stemmed from practical challenges rather than supernatural interference. But construction difficulties on such a symbolically important building naturally spawned stories and speculation. By the time the building was finished, it represented both architectural ambition and the messy reality of actually getting things built. And once occupied, the White House immediately became the setting for dramatic historical moments. Dolly Madison's daring rescue. When British troops marched on Washington in August 1814, Dolly Madison refused to flee until she'd saved what she could. Most importantly, Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington, an irreplaceable piece of national heritage. She had staff unscrew the frame from the wall. It was too large to remove quickly otherwise. With British soldiers approaching, she finally escaped by carriage, the portrait secured. Hours later, the British torched the White House, destroying everything Dolly hadn't managed to save. Her quick thinking preserved one of America's most iconic images. The portrait still hangs in the White House today, having survived fire, war, and 2 centuries of history. Dolly's courage in the face of invasion became legendary, though some accounts have embellished details over time. What's certain? She stayed longer than was safe, prioritized national symbols over personal belongings, and saved a masterpiece. But preservation wasn't the only drama future administrations would face. Sometimes the chaos came from much smaller sources. Theodore Roosevelt's guinea pig invasion. Theodore Roosevelt's children kept numerous pets in the White House, including guinea pigs that occasionally escaped their cages in the early 1900s. The small rodents would scurry through halls, hide under furniture, and generally create chaos during what were supposed to be dignified presidential events. Staff reports mention guinea pigs appearing in the most inconvenient places, during meetings, behind curtains, once allegedly in the Oval Office itself, where one nibbled the corner of state papers. The children named their pets after famous figures, treating them like tiny dignitaries. Recapturing escaped guinea pigs became a regular, if undignified, task for White House staff. The Roosevelt children viewed the entire building as their personal playground and menagerie, and the guinea pigs were just one element of the controlled chaos that characterized those years. But at least guinea pigs didn't require milking, which brings us to the next president's agricultural approach to White House lawns. Pauline Wayne, the last presidential cow. William Howard Taft kept a cow named Pauline Wayne on the White House grounds during his presidency from 1909 to 1913. She grazed on the south lawn, providing fresh milk and butter for the presidential table. Pauline was the last cow to live at the White House, marking the end of an era when presidents treated the property more like a working farm than a symbolic residence. She was a Holstein, well behaved by cow standards, and became something of a celebrity. Children would come to see the presidential cow. Newspapers covered her activities with surprising frequency. When Taft left office, Pauline was retired to a farm, having served her country by providing dairy products and mild entertainment. Future presidents would opt for dogs, cats, and other conventional pets, but Taft's cow represented a connection to America's agricultural past that would never return to the White House lawn. Speaking of unconventional pets, the previous administration had experimented with wildlife. Calvin Coolidge's raccoon collection. Calvin Coolidge and his wife Grace kept numerous unusual pets during the 1920s, including a raccoon named Rebecca, who was originally sent to be Thanksgiving dinner. The Coolidges decided to keep her instead. Rebecca had the run of the White House, climbing curtains, exploring rooms, and generally behaving like a raccoon, which is to say, causing mischief. She had a special house built for her, but preferred the main residence. The Coolidges walked her on a leash around the grounds like a dog, which must have been quite a sight for tourists. Rebecca eventually became too wild, even for the Coolidges' tolerance, and was donated to a zoo. But during her White House tenure, she represented the Coolidges' affection for unusual animals. They also kept a wallaby, a pygmy hippo, and various other creatures, gifted by foreign dignitaries. The White House briefly resembled a small zoo, though thankfully most of the animals were better behaved than Rebecca. The next president's children would bring their own brand of chaos, though theirs involved less biting. The dumbwaiter incident, Franklin Roosevelt's children were known for their pranks during the 1930s. One son, accounts vary on which one, reportedly hid in a White House dumbwaiter as a joke. These small elevators were designed for moving food and dishes between floors, not people. When the dumbwaiter was activated, it descended to the basement with the boy inside, sparking momentary panic when staff couldn't find him. He was eventually located, unharmed, but probably lectured about the dangers of hiding in mechanical lifts. The Roosevelt children tested boundaries constantly, treating the White House like their personal adventure playground, much as the Roosevelt cousins had done decades earlier under Theodore. Staff learned to expect the unexpected, checking unusual places during searches, maintaining patience with the energetic young people who'd suddenly found themselves living in the nation's most famous house. But not all White House entertainment involved actual children. Sometimes adults played at being frightened. Eleanor's wartime party. During World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt hosted numerous events to boost morale for service members. In 1944, she organized what some accounts describe as a haunted house style party for visiting sailors, complete with theatrical decorations and volunteers playing ghosts. Dry ice created eerie fog. Staff dressed in sheets jumped out at appropriate moments. It was meant to be fun, a brief escape from wartime stress. According to reports, at least one sailor fainted, either genuinely frightened or perhaps overwhelmed by the combination of surprise and the honor of being in the White House. Eleanor, ever practical, had smelling salts ready. The party continued after the young man recovered, probably mortified, but with a story his grandchildren would never believe. It was vintage Eleanor, finding unconventional ways to support troops, mixing formal prestige with down-to-earth fun. But not all White House parties went according to plan, as future administrations would discover through more embarrassing failures. The Eisenhower-era slip. The 1950s and 60s were relatively calm periods for White House chaos, though minor incidents still occurred. Staff members occasionally faced the kinds of everyday accidents that happen in any large building: slips, trips, spills. These moments rarely made headlines because they lacked historical significance, but they were part of the daily reality of working in the White House. Hundreds of people moved through those halls every day, and not every moment was dignified. Press secretaries, military aides, kitchen staff, and maintenance workers all faced the basic hazards of navigating a busy workplace. The White House was simultaneously a museum, office building, residence, and tourist attraction. That combination created unique challenges and occasional mishaps that stayed internal unless they involved someone important enough that the story leaked. Most White House workers experienced their share of embarrassing moments that never reached public knowledge. But some incidents were too visible to hide, especially when they happened during major events. Tricia Nixon's wedding. On June 12, 1971, Tricia Nixon married Edward Cox in the White House Rose Garden. It was the first outdoor White House wedding, carefully planned for months. The ceremony went smoothly, the weather cooperated, and hundreds of guests witnessed the historic event. The reception featured an elaborate wedding cake, multiple tiers decorated with intricate frosting. Everything proceeded according to plan. The music, the toasts, the dancing. The Nixons had created a picture-perfect event despite the political turmoil surrounding the administration. The wedding became one of the few universally positive moments during Nixon's presidency. A reminder that behind the politics, the White House remained home to actual people experiencing life milestones. The reception cake stood as a centerpiece, photographs were taken, and the newlyweds began their life together with the nation watching. But not all state events ended quite so gracefully, as the next administration would discover in spectacular fashion overseas, though the incident would become forever associated with the presidency. The Tokyo Incident. On January 8, 1992, President George H.W. Bush attended a state dinner in Tokyo with Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa. Bush had been feeling ill but attended anyway. Midway through the dinner, he vomited on the Prime Minister's lap, then fainted briefly. The incident was captured on video and broadcast worldwide, creating the kind of diplomatic nightmare no protocol manual adequately addresses. Bush recovered quickly, later joking about it, but the moment became infamous. The Japanese even created a new word, bushisaru, meaning to do a bush or to vomit publicly. Bush handled the aftermath with characteristic grace, making self deprecating jokes and moving forward. But the incident served as a reminder that presidents are human, subject to illness, exhaustion, and bodily functions that don't respect diplomatic schedules. It was mortifying, viral before viral was really a thing, and ultimately survivable. The next president would face his own very public humiliation, though his involved more deliberate misconduct. The Lewinsky scandal recording. In 1998, the Clinton Lewinsky scandal broke open, involving recorded phone conversations between Monica Lewinsky and Linda Tripp. The recordings captured Lewinsky discussing her relationship with President Clinton, providing evidence that contradicted Clinton's initial denials. The tapes weren't made in the White House itself. Tripp recorded phone conversations, but they concerned activities that occurred in the Oval Office and surrounding areas. The scandal led to Clinton's impeachment by the House of Representatives, though he was acquitted by the Senate. The sordid details dominated news coverage for months. Clinton survived politically, but his legacy was permanently marked by the affair and the lies he told about it. The scandal reminded everyone that even the Oval Office couldn't guarantee privacy or discretion, especially when people involved decided to document everything. But at least Clinton's pet didn't add to his problems. The next president's cat, however, would cause its own chaos. India, the cat's stress response. George W. Bush's black cat. India lived in the White House during the presidency from 2001 to 2009. Like all cats, India had her own personality and stress responses. The post 9/11 period was tense throughout the White House, with increased security, constant meetings, and a building full of anxious humans. Animals pick up on that tension. India reportedly acted out occasionally, as cats do, knocking things off desks, hiding in inconvenient places, generally being feline during a period when everyone preferred calm predictability. The Bush family loved her despite her occasional misbehavior. She provided comfort during difficult times, a reminder that life continued even when the world felt chaotic. Pets in the White House served important roles beyond photo opportunities. They gave presidents and their families connection to normal domestic life amid the abnormal pressure of the office. And the next president's pets would continue that tradition, though sometimes their comfort came at a cost. Bo Obama's expensive taste. Bo, the Obama family's Portuguese water dog, arrived at the White House in 2009, a gift that delighted the Obama daughters. Bo was generally well behaved, but had his moments, as all dogs do. Like any puppy, he occasionally chewed things he shouldn't, explored rooms he was supposed to avoid, and generally tested boundaries. The Obama family dealt with these normal dog behaviors while trying to maintain the dignity of the presidency, which created some amusing juxtapositions. Here was the most powerful man in the world, negotiating with a dog about which furniture was acceptable to sleep on. Michelle Obama joked about Bo's antics in interviews, humanizing the first family. The dog became beloved by staff and public alike, appearing in official photos, greeting visitors, and providing the Obama daughters with companionship during their unique childhood. And with Bo's adventures covered, we've journeyed through the weird, the wild, and the absolutely true moments that made White House history stranger than fiction. Melania's fashion statement. On June 21st, 2018, Melania Trump wore a jacket to visit migrant children detained at the Texas border. The back read, "I really don't care, Dao you," in large white letters. The fashion choice sparked immediate controversy and confusion. What message was she sending? Who was it directed at? The White House insisted it meant nothing, just a jacket. Melania's spokeswoman claimed there was no hidden message, but the timing, visiting separated children during a humanitarian crisis, made the denial hard to swallow. Critics saw callousness, supporters saw media overreaction. Either way, the jacket became one of the most analyzed pieces of clothing in modern political history. Melania later said it was directed at the media, not the children. But the image of that jacket, worn on that particular trip, became seared into public consciousness as a symbol of either tone deafness or deliberate provocation, depending on your perspective. Fashion choices matter when you're a first lady, especially when they seem to contradict your stated mission. But clothing controversies were mild compared to the next president's medical suggestions. The disinfectant briefing. On April 23, 2020, during a COVID-19 press briefing, President Trump suggested that scientists should look into whether disinfectant could be injected into the body to fight the virus. He also mentioned UV light treatments inside the body. The comments, made at the White House podium with medical professionals standing nearby looking increasingly uncomfortable, sparked immediate alarm. Poison control centers were flooded with calls. Medical experts rushed to issue warnings. Do not inject or ingest disinfectants. Lysol released a statement explicitly telling people not to use their products internally. Trump later claimed he was being sarcastic, though the video showed no indication of sarcasm. The incident became emblematic of the chaotic federal response to the pandemic. Confusing messages, dangerous suggestions, and scientists struggling to correct misinformation coming from the president himself. It was surreal, frightening, and unfortunately, very real. But medical confusion wasn't new to the White House. Earlier presidents had their own ways of accidentally revealing sensitive information. Monroe's diplomatic parrot problem. James Monroe served as president from 1817 to 1825, and while detailed records of White House pets from that era are sparse, parrots were popular among wealthy households. African gray parrots, known for their remarkable ability to mimic human speech, were particularly prized. These birds can learn hundreds of words and phrases, repeating them at inopportune moments. If Monroe did keep a parrot, and several sources suggest he maintained various pets, it would have posed interesting security challenges during an era when cabinet discussions happened in relatively open White House spaces. Parrots don't understand discretion. They repeat what they hear, often at the worst possible times, potentially squawking fragments of conversations within earshot of visiting diplomats or staff. Whether Monroe's household actually included such a bird, and whether it caused diplomatic embarrassments, remains difficult to verify from surviving records, but the possibility highlights how even small details of daily life could complicate presidential business. Speaking of complications, the next president's wife had very specific rules about White House behavior. Sarah Polk's temperance reign. Sarah Childress Polk took her role as First Lady seriously when her husband James became president in 1845. Deeply religious and committed to temperance principles, she banned both alcohol and dancing from White House functions. This was revolutionary and deeply unpopular. Washington society was built on elaborate dinners with wine, balls with dancing, and generally having a good time. Sarah eliminated all of it. Foreign diplomats were horrified. Senators grumbled. Social leaders called her a killjoy. But Sarah held firm, believing the White House should model moral behavior for the nation. Some guests reportedly smuggled flasks to cope with the dry, dance-free events. The Polk White House became known for serious policy discussions rather than entertainment, which probably suited James just fine. He was famously workaholic and died just 3 months after leaving office, possibly from exhaustion. Sarah's strict rules made the Polk years memorable for all the wrong reasons socially, though she earned respect for her political acumen and principled stands. But at least she didn't dictate facial hair choices, though the next era would see dramatic changes there. Grace Bedell and Lincoln's beard. In October 1860, 11-year-old Grace Bedell from Westfield, New York, wrote to presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln suggesting he grow a beard. She thought whiskers would improve his appearance and help him win votes because, All the ladies like whiskers. Lincoln actually responded, gently questioning whether people might think such a change peculiar. But after winning the election, Lincoln did grow a beard, becoming the first bearded president. When his train stopped in Westfield en route to his inauguration, he specifically asked to meet Grace, stepped off the train, and reportedly told the crowd, "You see, I let these whiskers grow for you, Grace." It's a charming story about a president listening to a child's advice, and it's well documented. Lincoln kept the beard for the rest of his life. Every bearded president since owes a debt to Grace Bedell's bold letter and Lincoln's willingness to take fashion advice from an 11-year-old girl. But Lincoln wasn't the only 19th century president to make unexpected personal choices. Baby Ruth and the candy controversy Grover Cleveland's daughter Ruth was born in the White House in 1891, the first child of a sitting president born there. She became a media sensation, the presidential baby adored by the public. Tragically, Ruth died of diphtheria at age 12 in 1904. Years later, when the Curtis Candy Company released the Baby Ruth candy bar in 1921, they claimed it was named after Ruth Cleveland, not baseball legend Babe Ruth. This naming choice sparked decades of debate. Was it really honoring a dead president's daughter? Or was it exploiting Babe Ruth's fame without paying him endorsement fees? The timing was suspicious. Babe Ruth was at peak popularity in 1921. The company insisted on the Ruth Cleveland story, even though she'd been dead for 17 years and wasn't particularly relevant to candy marketing. Most historians believe it was about the baseball player, but the company maintained the presidential daughter story until it finally became legally irrelevant. Either way, a White House baby's name became tied to chocolate for over a century. Speaking of White House animals with lasting cultural impact, Theodore Roosevelt created the most famous toy in history, the birth of the teddy bear. In November 1902, Theodore Roosevelt went bear hunting in Mississippi. The trip was unsuccessful until guides cornered and tied an old bear to a tree, suggesting Roosevelt shoot it for a trophy. Roosevelt refused, calling it unsportsmanlike. A political cartoon by Clifford Berryman depicted the scene with a cute bear cub, and the image went viral by 1900 standards. Morris Misham, a Brooklyn toy maker, created a stuffed bear and asked Roosevelt's permission to call it Teddy's Bear. Roosevelt agreed, though he doubted it would amount to much. He was spectacularly wrong. Teddy bears became one of the most enduring toys in history, still popular over a century later. Roosevelt's act of sportsmanship in refusing to shoot a helpless bear accidentally created a global merchandising empire. The irony that Roosevelt, an avid hunter who killed hundreds of animals, became associated with cuddly stuffed bears wasn't lost on anyone, but at least his legacy was positive, unlike some presidential relationships that caused nothing but drama. Wilson's White House wedding. Woodrow Wilson married Edith Boleyn Galt on December 18, 1915, in the White House Blue Room. It was only the second presidential wedding held in the executive mansion and the first during a sitting president's term. Wilson had been widowed the previous year and fell hard for Edith, a widow herself. Their courtship was brief and intense, complicated by Wilson's advisors who worried the quick remarriage would hurt his re-election chances. Wilson didn't care. The wedding was relatively small and private by White House standards, just family and close friends. Edith would later play a crucial role during Wilson's stroke, effectively running the presidency for 17 months while he recovered. The wedding marked the beginning of one of the most consequential First Lady tenures in American history, though no one knew it at the time. It was romantic, slightly scandalous in its speed, and ultimately created a partnership that would test constitutional boundaries regarding presidential succession. But at least Wilson's administration maintained some propriety, unlike the next president's scandal-plagued tenure. Harding's Ohio gang and bootleg operations Warren G. Harding brought his friends from Ohio dubbed the Ohio Gang, into his administration, and many of them were corrupt. During Prohibition, rumors swirled that bootleg alcohol flowed freely in certain White House rooms, smuggled in through various creative means. The Harding White House allegedly hosted poker games with illegal liquor, while the president publicly supported Prohibition. Albert Fall, Harding's Interior Secretary and Ohio gang member, would orchestrate the Teapot Dome scandal, secretly leasing federal oil reserves in exchange for bribes. It was the biggest political scandal before Watergate. Harding himself probably wasn't directly involved in the worst corruption, but he enabled it by appointing corrupt friends to powerful positions and looking the other way while they exploited their offices. Harding died suddenly in 1923, before the full scope of the scandals emerged. His reputation posthumously destroyed by revelations of the corruption that surrounded him. His administration proved that loyalty to friends is admirable, but blind loyalty to corrupt friends is presidential malpractice. The next president would restore dignity to the office, though in typically understated fashion. FDR's fireside chats and their origins. Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, beginning in 1933, revolutionized presidential communication. He spoke directly to Americans through their radios, explaining complex policy in accessible terms, using conversational language that made people feel he was talking to them personally in their living rooms. The chats were carefully scripted and rehearsed, though Roosevelt's delivery sounded spontaneous. He would practice different phrasings, test various tones, and work with speechwriters to find exactly the right words. The White House became a broadcast studio, with radio equipment set up in various rooms depending on the occasion. These chats helped Roosevelt build unprecedented public support for New Deal programs and later for American involvement in World War II. He used the intimacy of radio to bypass hostile newspapers and speak directly to citizens. It was brilliant political communication that created a template future presidents would follow. Roosevelt understood that explaining policy was as important as making policy, and his fireside chats proved that a president who could connect emotionally with citizens had enormous power to shape public opinion and drive legislative agendas. The buck stops here. Harry Truman kept a sign on his Oval Office desk reading, "The buck stops here." It became one of the most famous presidential symbols, representing Truman's willingness to accept responsibility for difficult decisions. The phrase came from poker. Passing the buck meant passing responsibility. Truman's sign declared he wouldn't pass the buck. The ultimate responsibility rested with him. He made agonizing decisions during his presidency, dropping atomic bombs on Japan, firing Douglas MacArthur, desegregating the military, intervening in Korea. Each decision attracted fierce criticism. Each time, Truman stood by his choices, accepting that being president meant making calls no one else could make and living with the consequences. The sign captured his personality perfectly. Plain-spoken, accountable, unflinching. It wasn't fancy political rhetoric. It was a simple statement of presidential duty. After Truman left office, that sign became symbolic of presidential leadership itself. The idea that someone ultimately has to make the hard calls and own the outcomes. Modern presidents face the same reality Truman's sign declared. When you're president, there's nowhere left to pass the buck. Speaking of presidents and their hobbies, the next administration brought golf back to the White House with unprecedented enthusiasm. Eisenhower's golf obsession. Dwight Eisenhower loved golf so much, he installed a putting green on the South Lawn and played at every opportunity. His dedication to the sport became something of a joke among political cartoonists and critics who suggested he spent more time on the links than in cabinet meetings. Eisenhower didn't care. He viewed golf as essential stress relief from the pressures of the Cold War presidency. He played with fellow generals, business leaders, and congressmen, using the golf course as an informal meeting space where relationships could be built away from formal Washington settings. His putting green became famous, frequently photographed, and frequently targeted by squirrels who insisted on burying acorns in it. Eisenhower's golf habit set a precedent for future presidents who needed physical activity and mental breaks from the unrelenting pressure of the office. He made it acceptable, even expected, for presidents to have recreational outlets. Though critics would always complain about any president's leisure time, Eisenhower proved that competent leadership didn't require constant desk sitting. But the next president would find very different ways to apply pressure on people around him. The Johnson treatment. Lyndon Johnson was famous for the Johnson treatment, his aggressive method of persuading people to support his agenda. He would corner someone, invade their personal space, lean in close, and deploy a combination of flattery, threats, logic, and sheer physical intimidation. Johnson was 6'3", imposing, and completely willing to use his size advantage. He'd poke fingers near people's faces, grip their shoulders, and talk at them until they either agreed or fled. Senators, cabinet members, and advisors all experienced the treatment. Some found it effective leadership, others considered it bullying. Either way, it worked. Johnson passed more significant legislation than almost any president. The Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, and numerous Great Society programs. The Johnson treatment helped him twist arms and change votes, applying personal pressure where political logic alone might have failed. Whether you admired or deplored his methods, Johnson proved that sometimes legislation requires more than speeches and debates. Sometimes it requires getting right up in someone's face and refusing to take no for an answer, which might not be genteel but can be effective. Ford's infamous stumble, Gerald Ford, had an unfortunate reputation for physical clumsiness, largely undeserved but perpetuated by media coverage and Saturday Night Live parodies. The most famous incident occurred when he stumbled descending the stairs from Air Force One in 1975. The fall was caught on camera and replayed endlessly, cementing Ford's image as awkward despite being one of the most athletic presidents. He'd played football at the University of Michigan and was in excellent physical condition. Ford laughed off the jokes, understanding that presidential image sometimes matters more than presidential reality. He'd served competently through difficult post-Watergate years, pardoned Nixon in a controversial but arguably necessary move, and guided the country through economic troubles. But Americans remember him stumbling down airplane stairs because video is powerful and repeated images create lasting impressions. Ford's clumsiness became his defining characteristic in popular culture, overshadowing his actual accomplishments and character. It was unfair but also unavoidable in an age of television and comedy shows looking for easy targets. At least Ford could laugh at himself. The next president's relationship with advice came from somewhat less conventional sources. Nancy Reagan's astrologer. After the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981, Nancy Reagan became increasingly protective and anxious about her husband's safety. She began consulting astrologer Joan Quigley to determine favorable and unfavorable dates for presidential activities. Quigley would analyze astrological charts and advise Nancy on timing for speeches, trips, and important events. Nancy would then push staff to schedule around Quigley's recommendations, sometimes creating logistical nightmares. The arrangement remained secret until 1988, when former Chief of Staff Donald Regan revealed it in his memoir. The revelation sparked mockery and criticism, the president's schedule influenced by horoscopes, but Nancy defended the practice, explaining she'd try anything to keep her husband safe. Whether Quigley's advice actually affected major policy decisions or just scheduling remains debated. What's clear, a sitting First Lady consulted an astrologer for years, and senior staff accommodated her request to keep the peace. It was strange, humanizing, and a reminder that even powerful people can be superstitious when facing their fears, but at least astrological scheduling didn't cause physical violence, unlike the next president's pets. Bill Clinton's cat, Socks and dog Buddy famously didn't get along during the late 1990s. Socks had been the Clintons' pet since the Arkansas governor's mansion, essentially the first pet before Buddy arrived in 1997. Suddenly, Socks had to share territory with a boisterous Labrador retriever who had no respect for feline boundaries. The two fought constantly. Clinton joked about it in interviews, describing the ongoing war between his pets. Staff reported finding them in standoffs in various White House rooms, Socks hissing from high furniture, while Buddy barked from below. When the Clintons left office in 2001, they made a controversial decision. Buddy went with them to New York, while Socks went to live with Clinton Secretary Betty Currie. The explanation was that the pets simply couldn't coexist peacefully, and separating them was kindest for both. Buddy was tragically hit by a car in 2002. Socks lived until 2009. Neither ever reconciled, their feud remaining one of the more memorable aspects of the Clinton White House pets. Speaking of rebellious White House residents, the next president's daughters brought their own brand of mischief, the Bush twins and their adventures. Jenna and Barbara Bush were 19 when their father became president in 2001. They attended college and lived somewhat normal lives, but stayed in the White House during breaks, which occasionally created minor security complications. They were young adults with the normal young adult desires for independence and fun, living under Secret Service protection in the most famous house in America. The Bush daughters were photographed at parties, dealt with media scrutiny about their personal lives, and generally navigated the impossible situation of being teenagers and young adults in the presidential spotlight. George and Laura Bush tried to give them as much normalcy as possible, which meant tolerating some typical college-age behavior while maintaining presidential family standards. The twins later wrote books and gave interviews about their White House experiences, describing it as simultaneously privileged and suffocating. They had opportunities most people can't imagine, but couldn't make mistakes privately. Everything became public, magnified, analyzed. They survived the experience and developed empathy for future presidents' children facing similar challenges. At least their mischief was relatively innocent compared to the chaos the next first family's children would bring. The Obama girls' White House childhood, Malia and Sasha Obama, were 10 and 7 when they moved into the White House in 2009. Making them the youngest presidential children to live there since the Kennedys. The Obamas worked hard to give them normal childhoods despite the abnormal circumstances. They had sleepovers with friends, attended regular schools, did chores, and faced consequences for misbehavior. The girls explored the historic building, learned its history, and gradually came to understand the weight of living in such a symbolic space. They hosted school friends for sleepovers, turning the White House into something resembling a normal home for brief periods. Michelle Obama was fiercely protective of their privacy, largely succeeding in keeping them out of the political spotlight. The girls aged through crucial developmental years under constant Secret Service protection, their teenage years documented by photographers whenever they appeared in public. They both grew into poised young adults, a testament to their parents' efforts to maintain family normalcy amid presidential chaos. Speaking of chaos, the next administration's pets would create security problems of a very different nature. Commander Biden's biting record president, Biden's German Shepherd commander, had a serious biting problem during his time at the White House. The dog bit multiple Secret Service agents. Reports vary on exact numbers, but confirmed incidents totaled in the double digits, resulting in at least one hospitalization. Commander was eventually removed from the White House and relocated, officially for additional training. The incidents raised questions about liability, safety protocols, and what happens when the president's pet poses an actual physical threat to staff who can't exactly refuse to work there. German Shepherds can be protective and reactive, especially in high stress environments with constant strangers. Commander apparently found the White House deeply stressful and expressed that stress through his teeth. The Biden family was criticized for keeping an aggressive dog in an environment where he was clearly unhappy and dangerous. But removing a beloved family pet is emotionally difficult, even when necessary. Eventually, safety concerns overrode attachment, and Commander left for a quieter environment where he hopefully stopped biting people. The incidents added an unusual footnote to the Biden presidency: most dangerous presidential pet in modern history. Which brings us to our final bizarre White House moment: the ghosts that remain. The White House turns 225 in 2025, more than 2 centuries of history compressed into 55,000 square feet of office space, residence, and museum. Every president leaves something behind: policies, portraits, furniture, and, according to dozens of staff members across decades, occasionally something less tangible. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the building's history weighs heavy. Lincoln died violently. So did Kennedy. Wilson suffered a devastating stroke in those rooms. FDR died during his 4th term. Countless decisions made within those walls sent people to war, changed millions of lives, shaped history. That kind of concentrated human experience leaves traces, whether you interpret them as spirits or simply the heavy atmosphere of accumulated significance. Staff still report unexplained sounds, cold spots, and the general feeling of being watched in certain rooms. Maybe it's ghosts. Maybe it's old buildings settling. Maybe it's people projecting history onto ambiguous experiences. But after 2 centuries, everyone who spends significant time there has a story about something slightly odd, something they can't quite explain, something that reminds them the White House is never just a building. It's where American history breathes. And that brings us to the present day, where allegedly, if you listen carefully at 3 in the morning, you can still hear the ghost of William Howard Taft splashing around in his oversized bathtub, calling for more hot water. 225 years of history, 46 presidencies, countless pets, scandals, ghosts, fence jumpers, and moments that make you wonder how we made it this far as a country. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be thankful you're not the one explaining to foreign diplomats why there's an alligator in the hallway, or why your parrot just swore at the French ambassador, or why you got stuck in your own bathtub. The White House has seen it all. And somehow democracy survived every weird, wonderful, ridiculous moment of it. Sleep well, and remember, history is stranger than any story we could make up. Sweet dreams.